One of the beauties of our federal system has been the differences between the states. If you didn't like the taxes in Massachusetts, you could move to New Hampshire. If you objected to all the pervasive government in New Jersey, you could move to Pennsylvania. As President Reagan once put it, you could vote with your feet. This is no longer true. The Congress has usurped so much power from the states via legislation and outright bribery that you can hardly tell the difference from one state to another. But every state has the right to nullify and, I would argue, to secede from the Union. It was understood by the people who wrote the Constitution. When George Washington signed the Fugitive Slave Law, which required the capture of runaway slaves and immunized the person doing the capturing from prosecution for kidnapping, the state of Massachusetts nullified that law and said it would prosecute for kidnapping anyone in the state of Massachusetts who cooperated with it. A state nullified a federal law. This hasn't happened on a grand scale since the days of slavery, but it is a check. It is still a constitutional check on the overbearing, heavy hand of the federal government that a state would say enough is enough. Secession would cause a tremendous constitutional crisis. But if enough states call for a constitutional convention, if enough states tell the folks in those states they don't have to comply with certain unconstitutional federal laws, if enough states threaten to secede from the Union, the Congress would finally start listening. The state today that's leading the charge against the federal government is Little Vermont. Here to discuss the Vermont secession strategy is Kirkpatrick Sale, the director of the Middlebury Institute for the Study of Separatism, Secession, and Self-Determination, and a fierce defender of civil liberties. Mr. Sale, welcome to Freedom Watch.
Thank you very much.
Professor, what's in the water in Vermont? Why and how is a state that has folks representing it in the Congress who call themselves, at least in the case of Senator Sanders, socialist, leading the charge to break away from monster government in Washington?
Well, it's hard to say, really. I'm not myself in Vermont, but I have been intimate with the whole process in Vermont of how it began about 6-7 years ago. And I think that it is because there is a separate culture in Vermont. People there think of themselves differently. They realize that the word Vermont is a kind of a brand name, and they see themselves as different from the Yorkers on one side and the New Hampshires on the other. And in fact, in geographical terms, they are bounded by water, and so that they, both in terms of culture and a bioculture, they are different from their neighbors.
What will happen if the state of Vermont enacts legislation that authorizes people in Vermont on a widespread scale to void or evade federal law? I mean, let's say the legislature of Vermont says you don't have to pay federal income taxes anymore, or you don't have to obey this statute, or if you don't have to obey that statute. As a practical matter, won't the feds come in and file some sort of a complaint in a federal court and get a federal judge sitting in Vermont to say, what are you, crazy? You have to abide by the same laws as the rest of us. Now, I ask you this question, as you know, as a person who agrees with you on the concept of nullification and secession. But what do you think will happen up there?
I don't think they would go about it that way. I don't think they would do it piecemeal, which is what nullification is. And in fact, I think that you would see nullification sooner in places like Montana and Tennessee over the issue of gun control, where legislatures there have already put out what is unmistakably a nullification-like declaration. And they say that they will not allow the feds to come in and interfere with their state commerce.
All right, what is the burning issue in Vermont? What do you think will be the trigger there, and what do you think will happen? Will the legislature actually purport to secede from the Union. Yeah, I have read, and it may have been your works, Professor, I don't know, that Vermont, when it entered the Union, reserved the right to leave. It's not the only state that has claimed that right to do so peacefully, not over slavery, but over sovereignty. What do you think?
It did not declare that specifically, although Virginia, New York, and Rhode Island did specifically, but they didn't because it was assumed. And it was assumed by all of the people in the colonies that if you joined this United States thing, you could back out of it anytime you wanted to. The reason that nothing is said about secession in the U.S. Constitution is that the Founding Fathers merely assumed it and didn't feel that they had to spell it out. And so I think that the people in Vermont, I mean, if you could elect a legislature that was for Vermont independence, I think it would go beyond nullification to having a large majority of the legislature agree to secede, or else call a statewide convention and have the people themselves make a decision about whether to secede or not.
All right, if something like this happens, if the state of Vermont attempts to leave the Union or proclaim itself the Second Vermont Republic, and of course Vermont, like Texas, once was a separate and totally independent country, do you think that this would have a good result in Washington, or do you think we'd see force of arms sent to Vermont to get these people back into Washington's way of thinking?
It's hard to imagine that they would send in the Marines to tiny little Vermont if it wanted to be independent. But the people in Vermont, thinking about exactly what the process would be, have said that they, in the first place, need to have an overwhelming majority of the voters or the legislature in favor of this. Then they need to go out and reach to other states and say, don't you think that we have the right to do this? And then ultimately go out to world opinion.
Right.
And out there in the world, there are a great many nations that have been created by secession.
Right.
And they would, you would believe, be on your side. So that would make it very difficult for Washington to send the troops in.
You know, if you read the Declaration of Independence, which of course is not just Jefferson's musings, it's the law of the land, it articulates the view that when the government usurps liberty, it is the duty of the people to alter and abolish it or to separate themselves from it. I mean, Jefferson was writing a treatise purporting to justify morally, legally, politically, and historically a form of secession in which the 13 colonies seceded from Great Britain. That's how we got started.
It wasn't a revolutionary war. They didn't want to take over London. They wanted to separate from London. It was a war of secession, and the Declaration is the founding document of that theory of secession that they put into practice.
Professor Kirkpatrick Sale from the Middlebury Institute, keep plugging away, and thanks for joining us on Freedom Watch.
Thanks, Judge. Thanks for having us.
Sure.